Too calm? Too perfect? Sometimes all it takes is an evening cup of coffee for something to begin, something that shatters everything you thought you knew about intimacy, love, and loyalty. He came home expecting the usual quiet, the familiar comfort. But in the dim light of the living room, it wasn't silence that awaited him. It was a revelation, spoken softly, yet cutting through everything he believed was unshakable. One question, one idea. And in that suggestion, a crack from which the fault line in their marriage began to spread. Curiosity? A rebellion against routine? Or the first step toward a place from which there's no return? Hello, my friend. I'm so glad you stopped by my channel. If you're here for the first time, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends or family. It really helps my channel a lot. Please tell me in which city or country you watched this video. I value every one of your comments. So, let's get started. The day's exhaustion still lingered in Miles's body as he slowly pulled into the driveway and shut off the engine. His muscles ached from head to toe, but the thought of finally being home offered a small sense of relief. With a long breath, he picked up his briefcase and made his way to the front door. The moment he stepped inside, he was greeted not with comfort, but with a silence that felt unnaturally heavy. The living room was dimly lit, and Lena sat on the couch, but there was something strangely different about the scene. She wasn't casually flipping channels or skimming through a book like she usually did. Instead, she remained completely still, hands resting in her lap, her eyes distant and unfocused. Miles placed his briefcase down near the door and cautiously walked toward her. "Hey, everything okay?" he asked gently, trying not to reveal the growing tension coiling inside him. Lena lifted her gaze and gave him a small, uneasy smile, though the strain in her expression made it clear that something was bothering her. "Hi, Miles," she replied softly, barely above a whisper. There was hesitation in her voice, as though she didn't quite know how to begin. Miles sat beside her, sensing the presence of something unspoken that was weighing heavily in the room. The atmosphere felt thick with the pressure of things unsaid, but he didn't press her to speak. He sat quietly, watching as she took a slow breath and began fiddling with the edge of her dress, an old nervous habit he recognized immediately. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she said finally, her tone even but subdued. "About us, about where we are. It all feels so monotonous lately." Miles felt a knot forming in his chest, but he said nothing, focusing on every word. Lena paused, as if carefully considering her next sentence. "It's not that I'm unhappy," she went on. "I really do value what we've built together. I love you. I mean that. But something feels off. It's like we're stuck in this never-ending cycle," she explained. "Everything's become so expected, so routine." Miles gave a slight nod, trying to seem receptive even as his thoughts began to race. What was she getting at? Lena hesitated before continuing. "This might sound odd," she said, cautiously meeting his eyes. "But while I was looking for ways to shake things up, an idea crossed my mind." Her voice changed just a little. There was something more tentative in it now. "It's a bit unorthodox," she added. Miles felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of idea?" he asked, careful to keep his voice steady. Lena looked away, almost as if preparing herself for his reaction. "I've been reading about couples who break out of routine by doing something completely unexpected. Something bold," she said. "And it got me thinking, what if we went to a swing club?" The words landed with startling clarity, sending a ripple through the air between them. Time seemed to halt for a moment. Miles blinked, stunned, struggling to process what he'd just heard. "A swing club?" he repeated, wondering if he'd misunderstood. Lena nodded quickly, her voice becoming more earnest. "I'm not suggesting we jump into anything. We don't even have to participate. It's more about exploring something new, together." Her eyes held a hopeful look, but Miles sat frozen, too caught off guard to speak. His thoughts raced, Disbelief, shock, a strange sort of intrigue. He never would have expected Lena to bring up something like this. As much as he wanted to be supportive, her proposal had completely thrown him. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier with each passing second. Her suggestion echoed in his mind, every word ringing louder than the last. That night, while Lena lay sleeping beside him, perhaps feeling some peace after having finally said what was on her mind, Miles stared up at the ceiling, wide-eyed. He couldn't shake the conversation from his thoughts. A swing club. The very phrase made him feel like he'd been thrust into foreign territory, as if the very structure of their marriage had been quietly upended. In the days that followed, Miles went through the motions of daily life, but his thoughts never strayed far from Lena's words. The idea clung to him, constantly whispering questions he didn't yet know how to answer. What exactly had she meant by it? What was she really feeling? Was she bored? Was she looking for something he hadn't provided? Or was it simply curiosity? He wanted to downplay the gravity of it, but the way she had looked at him that night said otherwise. This wasn't an idle suggestion. There had been meaning behind it. Eventually, Miles did something completely out of character. He started researching. Late at night, once Lena was asleep, he'd quietly open his laptop and start typing phrases into search bars, feeling ridiculous and anxious all at once. He read blogs, watched explainer videos, browsed forums where people shared real experiences. Some painted the lifestyle as invigorating, a way to reconnect and find intimacy again. Others offered stark warnings, emotional scars, broken trust, irreversible consequences. He tried to absorb it all with a clear head, though an uneasiness lingered in the back of his mind. This wasn't a hypothetical situation. It was something his wife had actually proposed. The perspectives varied widely. Some couples found a new closeness, saying the experience helped them open up in ways they hadn't before. Others admitted it introduced strain, jealousy, or fractures that had been hidden beneath the surface. Miles read the posts of men who felt just like he did, caught off guard, uncertain, reluctant. A few said they'd found a deeper connection with their partners. Others confessed it only magnified their differences. As the days passed, Miles found himself wondering which path their relationship might take. More than anything, though, he found himself questioning who he really was. He had always seen himself as stable, traditional, a man who thrived on predictability. Lena's suggestion didn't just challenge their marriage, it challenged his identity. And yet, there had been something in her voice that night, a kind of vulnerability, a quiet honesty, that he couldn't ignore. He didn't know what his answer would be, but one thing had become clear. He could no longer pretend the question wasn't there. He didn't want to dismiss her feelings or act as if they weren't valid, but deep within, a rising fear kept gnawing at him, a quiet panic that this situation might already be slipping out of his hands. At work, he found himself adrift, staring blankly at the screen as unfinished tasks multiplied. Co-workers occasionally asked if something was wrong, but he offered only vague replies. It wasn't the kind of thing he could explain. This was something personal, something strictly between him and Lena, a burden that had slowly set them apart from the rest of the world. That distance, ironically, only deepened Miles's sense of solitude. One night, alone at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee warming his palms, he began to sift through his own thoughts. Was there a genuine part of him curious about Lena's suggestion, or was he simply clinging to the hope that agreeing might keep them from drifting further apart? Saying no outright felt like turning his back on her, ignoring what clearly mattered to her. But going along with it without conviction felt dishonest, to both of them. He found himself trapped, mentally circling the same questions with no clear answers. Miles understood another conversation was coming, unavoidable and necessary, but the idea of starting it made his chest tighten. What if he phrased something wrong? What if she misunderstood his hesitation? Lena had always been his safe space, the person he confided in most. But something had shifted. Her suggestion had quietly altered the dynamic, placing an invisible barrier where comfort used to be. It wasn't anger or resentment, just an unfamiliar, widening gap neither knew how to close. That night, as he lay beside her watching her sleep soundly, a heaviness settled over him. His love for her remained unwavering. But for the first time, he began to doubt whether love alone could bridge the divide forming beneath them. Still, Miles knew he couldn't avoid it forever. The next day, he practiced conversations in his head, rehearsing his words, trying to get the tone right. But when he finally walked through the door that evening, every line he'd prepared evaporated. Lena was in the kitchen, finishing dinner. The aroma from the stove mingled with the quiet hum of the space. She looked calm, but the silence between them buzzed with tension neither wanted to acknowledge. Dinner passed in heavy quiet, each bite weighed down by everything unspoken. Eventually, Miles placed his fork down and met her eyes with a steady look. "We need to talk about what you mentioned the other night," he said, his voice level but deliberate. Lena put her utensils aside and gave him her full attention. Her expression was soft but alert, as if she was prepared for both resistance and compassion. "All right," she said gently, her voice open yet cautious. Leaning forward, Miles rested his arms on the table. "I've been thinking about what you said, about trying something different, going beyond the boundaries we're used to. And honestly, I don't know if I'm truly ready for that. But I also don't want to ignore how you feel or act like your needs don't matter." He paused, watching her carefully to gauge her reaction before going on. "So, I'm willing to try. I don't know where it'll lead or how I'll feel, but I want to face it with you." Lena's expression softened with a quiet relief, and she offered a hesitant smile, as though cautiously optimistic. "Miles, I need you to know, this isn't because anything's broken between us. It's about exploring something new, together." He gave a slow nod, though a faint uncertainty still stirred within him. "I get that," he said, even if a part of him still wasn't sure he truly did. When the night finally came, Miles felt his nerves tightening with each tick of the clock. He kept adjusting his tie in front of the mirror, trying to present a calm he didn't actually feel. The destination loomed in his mind, making his stomach churn. Lena looked poised and graceful in a sleek black dress, her serene presence somehow both reassuring and alienating. She looked like she belonged to this moment, and that only deepened his unease. They drove in silence, the air between them thick with anticipation. The address she had given led them to a quiet, affluent neighborhood with trimmed lawns and spacious homes. When they pulled up in front of the house, Miles was struck by how understated it was. The modern architecture and subtle lighting gave it a refined elegance, with no obvious signs of what lay inside, just soft light behind tall windows and an air of curated discretion. A polished host welcomed them at the door, smiling warmly and gesturing them inside. As Miles stepped in, he was immediately caught off guard by the interior. Everything was tastefully arranged, from the minimalist decor to the ambient music playing softly in the background. The guests moved with calm confidence, dressed in refined clothing, speaking in low, easy tones. It was nothing like what he'd feared. There was no crudeness, no sleaze. It felt more like a sophisticated private gathering than anything else. As they walked through the main room, Lena gently squeezed his hand. "You all right?" she asked, her voice low. Miles scanned the space, took a breath, and nodded. "Yeah," he replied, though the tension inside him hadn't eased. And with that, they stepped further into unknown territory, side by side. The atmosphere was almost surreal, muted lights, mellow music, and a seamless sense of elegance. Holding a glass of wine offered at the entrance, Miles tried to keep his composure as he glanced from one quiet detail to the next. Lena, meanwhile, seemed effortlessly comfortable. She glided from one conversation to another with poise, as though she had always belonged here. Miles, on the other hand, focused on not looking out of place. Not long after stepping into the venue, they were approached by another couple. Adrian and Renee, impeccably dressed and radiating natural charm, greeted them with such genuine warmth that some of Miles's nervous energy began to ease. Lena was quickly pulled into a spirited exchange with Renee, their voices filled with laughter and affectionate compliments, while Adrian struck up a casual conversation with Miles, gently nudging him toward comfort. Gradually, Miles found himself loosening up, though a cautious edge remained. He couldn't ignore how animated Lena had become. Her laughter flowed freely, her gestures lively, and while part of him was relieved, another part felt quietly rattled. Lena looked entirely at ease in a place that, to him, still felt alien. As the evening unfolded, the conversation among the four of them grew more personal. Renee began sharing how she and Adrian had stumbled upon the club years ago and how it had brought unexpected closeness to their bond. Lena absorbed every word, visibly intrigued, her eyes bright with curiosity. Miles, however, stayed mostly silent, trying to piece together the implications. When Renee casually proposed the idea of the four of them exploring something together, Miles felt his heartbeat surge. He instinctively glanced at Lena, searching her face, and found her grinning. But it wasn't her usual smile. It carried a spark of hunger, of anticipation. The moments that followed blurred in Miles's memory. They were led to a quieter part of the venue where the mood darkened into something more suggestive. The lighting softened to a seductive dimness, and the entire space seemed to hum with sensual promise. Renee and Adrian returned, moving toward them with an ease that made Miles uncomfortable, as though this kind of encounter was no more extraordinary than polite conversation. Lena looked at him with an encouraging expression, and before he could figure out how to stop it, Renee's touch slid lightly along his arm. Miles froze, trapped between intrigue and detachment. Minutes passed as he tried to adapt, not out of desire, but from a need to keep pace with Lena. Adrian, composed and confident, began interacting with Lena as though it were second nature, while Renee mirrored that poise with Miles. The exchange unfolded with disarming smoothness, but Miles couldn't tear his eyes from his wife. Watching her in such close contact with another man stirred something chaotic inside him, equal parts curiosity and deep discomfort. It felt as if he had slipped into someone else's life, witnessing a scene he didn't belong in. At first, Miles tried to participate. He followed Renee's lead, responded where he could, and even experienced fleeting moments of ease. But everything changed when Lena, flushed and radiant, turned to him and said something that fractured his reality. "Let's go to a private booth," she said, her tone unshakably firm. "I want you with me, and I want other men too." Miles was stunned. The words hung in the air, almost too heavy to absorb. He couldn't form a reply. He just stared at her, shaken by what she had revealed. In that instant, she felt like a stranger. But Lena didn't wait for him to speak. She grasped his hand with quiet resolve and guided him through the throng. He followed, mute and reeling. The booth they entered was more secluded, cloaked in intimacy, yet it pulsed with intensity. To Miles's shock, several men were already inside. Lena lit up, as though this was the moment she'd been longing for all along. For Miles, though, everything started to slip into something surreal. He kept reminding himself that he'd agreed to this, for her, not for himself. But as he stood in the middle of it all, watching Lena engage so freely, a knot tightened in his chest. The way her focus shifted among the men, how her energy seemed to rise in their presence, it rattled something deep inside him. He couldn't name the emotion. It hovered somewhere between sorrow, confusion, and a deeper ache he hadn't yet identified. Everything slowed down. The warm lighting felt suffocating and stark. Miles tried to fix his gaze on Lena, to draw reassurance from her pleasure, her confidence. But his eyes always returned to the men around her. It was like watching his world fold in on itself, unfamiliar, distorted, unrecognizable. He no longer felt like a participant. He felt like a spectator on the edge of his own life. Lena, meanwhile, seemed transported, awakened. Time dragged painfully. Each playful look she cast at another man felt like a quiet wound, like something inside him was being chipped away. Again, he repeated the same thought. I agreed to this. I'm doing this for her. It's only an experience. But those words began to lose meaning. They rang hollow. He started noticing things he hadn't before. How freely Lena gave herself to the moment, how the men responded to her, how naturally she moved within this space. It wasn't simple jealousy. It was something deeper, something that questioned the very foundation of their relationship, what it had been, and what it was becoming. The atmosphere grew denser, pressing in around him. Miles glanced around the booth, taking in the others. For them, this was normal, a night of pleasure, maybe even connection. But for him, it felt like a riddle with no solution. He was trapped somewhere between two versions of himself, one who was supposed to belong here and one who absolutely didn't. That inner tension held him in place. And then a chilling realization struck him. Is this truly what Lena wants? And did I ever really know her at all? He found himself ruminating on all the instances where he had presumed to know what she felt or wanted, never once summoning the courage to ask her outright. Now, watching her fully immersed in a lifestyle that clearly brought her happiness, he felt as though everything they had built together was slowly unraveling beneath his feet. The background noises, soft laughter, hushed conversations, even the rhythmic sound of breathing, seemed to swell around him, each one amplifying the internal struggle he was trying to suppress. Lena, meanwhile, appeared completely unaware of his growing discomfort, and he wasn't sure what troubled him more, her lack of awareness or his need for her to notice. Part of him longed to retreat from it all, to step away from the tension, yet another part remained anchored, trapped not just by the moment, but by the emotional weight that held him still. Then something shifted in the room, something he couldn't ignore. Lena turned to look at another man, and in that glance there was a spark, an intensity he'd never seen in her eyes before. It was spontaneous, unrehearsed, and piercing in its authenticity. That single, unguarded look conveyed volumes, things they had never spoken about, things he wasn't sure he wanted to understand. He tried to look away, but her expression burned itself into his memory, as vivid and unrelenting as a wound that refused to heal. It was in that precise moment that the truth settled inside him with an unshakable finality. Something had irreversibly changed between them. The room, once sophisticated and inviting, now felt suffocating and alien. He tried to steady his breathing, but the air seemed to resist him, as though even the atmosphere conspired to keep him from finding calm. While Lena remained the center of attention, effortlessly drawing people in, he sat motionless, his thoughts frozen on the realization that they were no longer standing on common ground. The morning after their visit to the club, a thick, unspoken tension hovered over their breakfast table. Lena moved with a lightness, her energy bright and unbothered as she casually stirred her coffee, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Across from her, he sat in silence, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the edge of the table, his mind tangled in reflection. The sound of her fork hitting the plate rang out with unnatural clarity, magnifying the silence that neither of them dared to fill. "Last night was something else, don't you think?" Lena said cheerfully, her voice cutting through the quiet like a soft bell. Her attempt to lighten the mood landed heavily on him, as though each syllable carried its own weight. He forced a polite smile and replied, his voice barely above a whisper, "Yeah, it was definitely different." The strain behind his words unmistakable. Inside, he was caught in a labyrinth of emotion. How could he voice the truth without tearing something apart? Lena leaned forward, her hands wrapped around her cup. It felt like a breakthrough, didn't it? Like we were shedding old habits, rediscovering ourselves, she said, her gaze searching his face for a sign of agreement. "Don't you feel that too?" He hesitated, the tension in his chest growing tighter, honesty pressed against his throat, but the words were hard to form. "Maybe for you it felt freeing," he said slowly. But for me, it's more complicated. I don't know what to make of it. Lena's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. She placed her cup down and crossed her arms, leaning closer. What do you mean complicated? You seemed okay last night, she said gently, as though coaxing out the truth. I was trying to be, he admitted, the clink of his fork on the table punctuating his thoughts. I wanted to support you because I know how much it meant to you. But honestly, it's not something I want to go through again. That kind of experience just isn't for me. A subtle shift took place between them. Lena's earlier brightness dimmed, replaced by a quiet seriousness. Miles, I never wanted this to hurt you, she said softly, her sincerity unmistakable. He let out a long, weary breath and ran his hands down his face, trying to ease the heaviness of the moment. I guess I just needed a break from our routine, he confessed. I really tried to be open, to stand by your side. But stepping into that world, it made me realize I don't belong there. And seeing you so comfortable in it made me wonder if we're still looking for the same things. Lena sat in silence, her expression caught somewhere between regret and unease. After a long pause, she finally spoke. I never meant to push you away, Miles. Truly. That night, it awakened something in me. A part I didn't even know was missing. And now I feel like I need to explore it further. Her words struck him like a quiet warning. This wasn't just an experimental phase or fleeting interest. Something within her had shifted on a deeper level. Something that might carry her away from the version of life they had once shared. So, where does that leave us? He asked, his voice cracking with uncertainty. Lena's eyes dropped to her coffee cup, her fingers nervously twisting its handle. She struggled to find the right words. I don't know, she said finally, her voice low. I think we need to talk more, to really ask ourselves if we're still headed in the same direction. The weight of her words lingered like a slow-falling curtain. Over the weeks that followed, even as they tried to go back to their daily rhythms, the divide between them only widened. Lena radiated a newfound vitality, her steps lighter, her presence more animated. Miles, by contrast, felt himself slipping into the background, his connection to her growing fainter by the day. Every conversation became polite but empty, as if both were carefully avoiding the emotional undercurrent pulling them apart. Though they continued to share the same home, emotionally, they existed in entirely separate spheres. Their interactions were surface level, filled with small talk and silence. Even when they were side by side, Miles felt as though Lena was drifting toward a place he could no longer reach. Eventually, he began to question whether trying to bridge the gap made sense at all, or if it was time to quietly let her go. As the months wore on, the emotional distance between them became too large to ignore. What had once felt like a reliable, unwavering partnership now resembled a delicate thread unraveling under strain. Lena, increasingly absorbed in her personal journey of self-discovery, had begun spending more time outside the home, often explaining that solitude was essential to reconnect with herself. Miles tried to respect her wishes, though each time she left, the emotional distance between them seemed to expand, cutting deeper. One evening, she returned even later than usual, her face marked by a peculiar blend of eagerness and unease, like someone burdened with news they could no longer hold in. Miles was on the couch, the soft flicker of the television dancing across his face, though his attention was nowhere near the screen. The moment Lena stepped through the door, a familiar weight pressed against his chest, an internal alarm that something irreversible was drawing near. She sat beside him, consciously leaving a wider gap than she used to. Her mouth opened, then paused, as if caught in a tug-of-war between apprehension and urgency. At last, she spoke. "Miles," she began gently, her voice calm but firm. "We can't keep pretending everything's fine." He turned to her slowly, exhaustion etched into his features. "I'm here," he replied evenly, despite the storm beginning to build inside. Lena exhaled, as though steadying herself before leaping into cold water. I still love you. I always will, she said, eyes locked on his. But something shifted in me over the last few months. That night at the club, and everything that followed, opened my eyes to how little I really understand about myself. And I can't find clarity while we keep trying to mold ourselves into what we used to be. Her words hit like a blast of icy air. Though Miles had felt this moment creeping closer, hearing it spoken aloud shattered any illusion he'd held on to. "What are you trying to say?" he asked, the tremor in his voice betraying the hurt beneath the surface. Lena reached across the space between them, clasping his hands, her eyes now glistening with tears. "I think we need to separate," she whispered. "Not because I stopped loving you, but because staying in this limbo will only hurt us more. You deserve someone whose life still aligns with yours. And I'm not that person anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Though it felt as if the world had tilted out from beneath him, Miles found himself surrounded by a strange quietude, coexisting with the ache. Deep within, he recognized the honesty in her words. No matter how much they wanted to repair things, the gap between them had grown too wide to close. He gave her hands a gentle squeeze and met her tearful gaze. "I wish things hadn't come to this," he said softly. "I wish we still had a path back. But if this is what you need to feel whole, I won't hold you back." Lena began to sob, and Miles's throat tightened with emotion, but he held himself together, not for her, but for his own sense of dignity. They embraced tightly, saying goodbye without saying the word, their parting embedded in the silence between them. The next morning, Lena quietly began packing. The air inside the house was heavy, still, reverent. Words were scarce, not out of resentment, but because everything meaningful had already been said. When she finally stepped through the door with her suitcase, her expression bore the weight of grief mixed with a trace of hope. Miles stood at the threshold, silently absorbing the emptiness she left behind. The home, once warm and familiar, now seemed strangely vast and hollow in her absence. In the days that followed, Miles grappled with the shift in his world. Her presence lingered in subtle details, the faint trace of her perfume, the coffee cup she favored, the soft memory of footsteps down the hallway. Yet, amid the aching void, a faint calm began to take root. He came to understand that their separation wasn't an end, but the start of something painful yet essential, the process of rediscovering himself. At the same time, Lena ventured into uncharted parts of her life, exploring new experiences in an effort to uncover who she was outside of their relationship. Miles, still navigating the emotional wreckage, began piecing his routine back together. What they had shared remained a tender memory, both beautiful and agonizing. And though the past would always walk beside them, they knew that to truly find peace, they had to move forward, on separate paths. This story has come to an end. What's your opinion? Share it in the comments, my friend. And if you like this story, check out other exciting videos on my channel. I'll say goodbye until the next video. See you.